Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we tackled the Wind Temple, which I felt to be the game's intended first dungeon, since various NPCs and visual indicators seem to push you in that direction early on. And apparently, I was the only one who didn't know that you could dive through Colgera to deal damage. How did I not know this? How did I not figure this out? What do you mean you can dive through him? What? Anyways, just as before, I took some time to consider how and where the game ushers us to next, and what feels to be the game's intended second dungeon. First things first, just like last time, I have to offer my obligatory spoiler warning. Over the course of this video series, nothing is off the table for discussion as long as I feel it relates to the dungeon in question. So if you want to avoid spoilers, go ahead and save this video into your watch later list and come back after you've completed the dungeon featured here. It sounds obvious, but I've gotta say it. With that out of the way, let's hop right into things. So what is it that guided me to the Fire Temple next? Technically, there is no set official dungeon order, but the game does imply an order and works to usher players in a particular direction still, although in a way that is less heavy-handed than what we saw with the Wind Temple. For starters, Purah again straight up makes the suggestion of heading towards Death Mountain next if you return to Lookout Landing to speak to her. You'll also find a couple of travelers asking for and receiving detailed directions to Goron City while you're here. Between that, plenty of chatter among NPCs regarding new roads leading up towards Death Mountain since that lava all cooled, and the simple fact that the gloom haze emerging from the once active volcano is visible from pretty nearly the entire map. It's not a huge stretch to say that many players will be drawn towards here next. Death Mountain is a huge landmark, and even at a distance, it is notably different compared to how we saw it in Breath of the Wild. So I personally found myself wanting to check it out and see what's changed. And apparently I'm not the only one who was pulled in this direction by this point. I ran another poll just like before, this time asking which dungeon people had done second. And at the time of writing this, the poll already nearly has the same number of votes as the first one. And of those 844 voters, 45% went to the Fire Temple next. The results are certainly not as drastic as last time, but still nearly half of these people choosing this one out of 5 options still feels pretty substantial. Death Mountain itself feels incredibly fresh here. In Breath of the Wild, huge sections of the mountain were completely unexplorable due to massive pools of lava, including a huge caldera that forms a ring around the entire mountain. Now, all of this space is fully traversable and filled with caves, enemy camps, and various points of interest. We're also guided to approach the mountain from the west instead of the south this time. Factoring these in, this area all feels familiar yet fresh, a perfect balance. So now that we know where and why we are heading this way, let's look at the pre-dungeon stuff to do leading up to the Fire Temple. Despite the lava cooling, things aren't looking great here for the Gorons who make their home on the mountain. The typically hardworking and proud tribe has gone lazy, gorging themselves on strange rocks, which we can see as early as our climb up to the Bedrock Bistro and along our approach towards the city. Something is up with the Gorons, a lazy malaise. As it turns out, the regional crisis here on Death Mountain is the introduction of marbled rock roast. real talk here. The game plays it up for laughs, but this is legitimately serious. Ganon's plan in the 4 regions is to starve the Rito out with a blizzard, poison the Zora's water, and overrun the Gerudo with hordes of undead monsters. But for the Gorons, perhaps overpowering them didn't feel like a viable option. So instead, he starts a mass drug epidemic. I'm not even kidding, this is literally what is happening here. Granted, a cartoonish one, but still one nonetheless. These Gorons are suffering from addiction. They stop working and spend all day gorging themselves, prioritizing nothing else. The dialogue between this young Goron seeing his older brother succumb to addiction, while the older brother simply barks at him to get more money so he can buy more of this marbled rock roast, that is heartbreaking. Here in Goron City, we'll meet with old Bluto. Bloodo? I never know how to pronounce his name. And our old pal, Yunobo, who is not quite acting like himself. After a little bit of bullying, Bluto will nudge us to the new Yunobo Co. HQ, where we'll find Slurgo and Offrak, who will ask for our help setting Yunobo straight. Setting him straight means fighting him, naturally. Turns out he's being brainwashed, and breaking his mask frees him from this weird mind control business. We head up Death Mountain with Yunobo acting as our Cannonball Man, yet again. Cannonball Man! At the top, we'll battle Moragia, who breaks through the summit of the mountain. This is a fairly simple sort of mid-boss battle. It's fine, but overall, fairly forgettable. What I do love is seeing how willing to charge forward Yunobo is. This guy has seen some character growth between games, and I love that. We'll dive down into the depths and explore the darkness down here, with our sights set on a massive structure, the existence of which has been hinted to us by some NPC chattering. It is, of course, the dungeon, but before we head in, a few thoughts. It is interesting to me how freeform this lead up feels compared to the Wind Temple's approach. The path isn't as well defined as it was climbing up the rising chain islands, so it feels a little less refined and polished in comparison, but there's a lot of optional areas to explore and baddies to fight, which I find fun. It's very open and exploratory, meaning you can take the route that you feel is best, or you can take the minecarts and skip over all of that. Easy. Options are always good. Meanwhile, while I think the depths overall have this eerie vibe that I enjoy quite a lot, setting the dungeon and half of the dungeon approach down here is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they can use that eeriness, which is great. On the other hand, it also just isn't as unique. Yes, the depths are super expansive, but generally lacking in visual variety. If this is somehow your first time in the depths, then this could very well be incredible. But if you've spent a long time down here like I have, then it just doesn't pack the same punch. Again, a mixed bag. But I do think it is more fun than the climb up towards Vah Rudania that we did with Yunobo back in Breath of the Wild. With all of that said, once we've climbed our way over here, we can head into the dungeon. This is the Fire Temple, otherwise known as Gorondia, which is the name that makes way more sense. Like, if I'm being honest, it really feels as though they slapped the temple names onto these dungeons as an afterthought. Maybe in the hopes of making us old fans happy? I don't know. The Stormwind Arc was not really a temple, it's an airship, and Gorondia is not really a temple either. As we learned from various bits of NPC dialogue, these are the ruins of an ancient Goron civilization that lived underground in the ancient past. In a way, this was Goron City. Not the Goron City perhaps, but a Goron City, or at least what's left of it. Naturally, many of the buildings and structures have crumbled away or deteriorated to varying degrees. This could have actually been only one part of a much larger settlement, as we do see ruins outside of the dungeon borders. Even a hot spring, a Goron staple. Likely, Gorondia was once much larger than the handful of buildings remaining here. Visually speaking, this place has a whole vibe to it. I genuinely really love the architecture here. It's made of this distinct red stonework and has a somewhat industrial feeling, with these minecarts winding about. This place feels like perhaps it could have been a hub for a mining or excavation operation once run by the Gorons, with everything connecting back to a central plaza, which has both controls for directing minecarts as well as spare parts for the carts themselves. Wait. Gorons, mining operations, this feels familiar. Of course, like the Stormwind arc, there seems to be a blend of cultural styles here once again with the architecture, with Zonai influences being found pretty well everywhere. That said, the Zonai markings and devices all seem a bit out of place compared to the more plain Goron building style, which may hint towards Gorondia's age even more. It could be that the place was built by the Gorons only to have Zonai devices and markings retrofitted in later, once Hyrule and its monarchy was officially established. That's speculation on my part, of course, but it would explain why we find constructs guarding the place, and why Zonai devices such as these gongs, which act as mechanisms to unlock this gate, feel a bit out of place here. What I would guess was that they were built later on than the rest of the city, with Zonai assistance, but of course with the Goron's abilities in mind. The Gorons may have had a mining operation going on here, which the Zonai, perhaps even Minoru herself, helped them to later automate. So these minecarts, which are stamped with the Goron insignia and are distinct from the Zonai minecarts found in the sky, later have fans added to them, so that perhaps no Gorons need to pull them manually anymore, or eliminating the need for them to rely on gravity to pull them in a single direction. Again, this is all speculative, but it is interesting to look a little closer and see the kind of history that is implied through just the architecture here. Before we go any further, I'd like to talk about the music real quick. As usual, the dungeon music builds upon itself as we make progress. It starts out eerie, with haunting choir voices, which reminds me of the old Fire Temple theme from Ocarina of Time. It's not exactly those voices, but it feels like a callback to the feeling that old track had. Next, it brings in a slow beat with piano trills and some industrial sounding percussion, which is taken right from Varudania's theme. Phase 3 adds in even more layers and increases the tempo, giving the tension and feeling of triumph a simultaneous boost. Phase 4 does the same, but also incorporates Daruk's theme into the track. This part is my favorite section of this dungeon's music. It's more varied and interesting than the rest, and Daruk's theme gets to shine so nicely. It was already a great composition, but in Breath of the Wild, it always felt to me like it didn't quite suit the Goron champion. This rendition, on the other hand, feels far more fitting. It also feels like there's an element of danger to this track, competing with Daruk's more optimistic theme. And finally, in perhaps a strange choice, once all terminals are active, the track drops off almost entirely, leaving us with simple ambience. This is the final piece of music after completing pretty much everything in the dungeon, but before the boss fight, making this the calm before the storm in a sense. Overall, the Fire Temple's music is great. There's a lot of ambient sounds mingling together here, a solid beat, and familiar themes to tug at your nostalgia. It's wonderfully done once again. Actually playing through the Fire Temple is a divisive subject for many, one that seems awfully polarizing. Many call this place an outright headache, citing its over-reliance on minecarts and its layout that often involves entering certain rooms from particular floors as downright confusing, a chore that they don't really want to do. Others have called it a fascinating puzzle box that really tests the brain power of the player. I'll be honest, on my first playthrough, I did not lean either particular way with it. I had really no strong feelings about the dungeon either way, ranking it pretty squarely in the middle. But as I mentioned before, the playthrough I am doing for these videos is now my third save file. Now that I've had a chance to play it first on my own time, once more on stream, and now a third time for this video while taking notes, I find myself leaning towards the latter side. Each time I have ventured into this dungeon, I have approached it differently and left appreciating it more. That may come down to playstyle and what I enjoy about dungeons, but let's break it down a bit more thoroughly. The dungeon has 5 floors and is comprised of several isolated buildings that are connected by a winding system of minecart tracks. There's a central room on the 3rd floor that much of the dungeon connects back on as well, which also includes a shortcut that you can later unlock to quickly and easily return here. The objectives are once again to activate a handful of terminals to unlock the door to the boss chamber. All of this is done using minecarts to get around by activating switches to alter the track layouts, using hydrants to create platforms in the lava, not unlike the lava puzzles of Dragonroost Cavern in Wind Waker or the Fire Sanctuary in Skyward Sword, and combining all of these with Yunobo's fire charge ability in order to complete puzzles. As it stands, in no particular order, the puzzles roughly go like this. We make our way over to this room by way of minecart, switching the tracks appropriately as we go, make a stone ramp so that Yunobo can break this boulder, and activate the first terminal. Once more, navigate the tracks until we reach this room, use recall and ride this platform back across the lava, and activate the terminal. Make our way up to this far room upstairs, build an even larger ramp, and launch Yunobo to activate the terminal. Right up to the top floor so that we can climb in this room and drop down to the room directly below and activate the terminal. And finally, navigate to this room, have Yunobo break the rocks on the ceiling, ride the block that falls back up with recall, and activate the terminal. Taken on their own, these all sound pretty simple, but what this puzzle synopsis fails to capture is how large a part simply navigating to each of these spots plays. Making our way to each of the terminals is a challenge and a puzzle in and of itself. Some tracks are broken, so the direct route is not feasible. Some switches need to be activated at the right times to rearrange the tracks in a way that will take us to our intended destination. Some tracks are just blocked by marbled boulders that we need Yunobo to break. Actually activating the terminals is simple, but that moment acts as catharsis, the payoff for your efforts to just get there. On paper, this is all great stuff. A true, proper puzzle-focused dungeon, the likes of which we haven't seen in years. Except for one factor that vastly undermines this: the cheese factor. If you don't know what I'm talking about, allow me to indulge. Cheesing something is the act of circumventing an intended design by way of unintended and often easier methods, whether that be cheesing your way through a boss fight by spamming a particular move, or in this case, cheesing your way through an entire network of puzzles by using a rocket shield to bypass everything and head straight towards your objectives. In my Wind Temple video, I discussed how that dungeon elegantly designed around the cheese factor by playing placing all of our objectives below us within the dungeon. So even though we've retained all of our usual mobility, such as climbing, paragliding, and using ascend, we still had to operate within the intended parameters of the dungeon. There's no way to bypass a puzzle using ascend in that dungeon because we had to start at the top and work our way downwards. Simple, but effective. The Fire Temple unfortunately makes little effort to actually design around that cheese factor. A large and brilliant puzzle is laid out before us, but the temptation for many players to simply skip these puzzles altogether is too strong, and it undercuts their value. For this playthrough, I forced myself to not skip any puzzles, to not cheese anything. And you know what? I enjoyed this playthrough of the dungeon way more than the previous two. The satisfaction of figuring out the layout, using switches to connect, redirect, and reconnect tracks, and reaching my objectives that way was incredible. I've said it before, this may be a matter of taste. My favorite dungeons are the kind that are not a series of rooms with individual puzzles, but rather a singular, larger puzzle that makes use of a great core mechanic, the likes of the forest or water temples. That's what we get here, and it is great if you choose to engage with it. The question then is, how could that have been improved upon? How do we design around that cheese factor? Some would say that disabling ascend or limiting our mobility would be the answer. For example, shrines prevent you from climbing while you're inside of them. Why not follow suit here? But I disagree. I propose a much simpler solution. Instead of stripping Link of his mobility, limit Yunobo's. Yunobo is both our companion and dungeon item in a sense. His fire charge is key to removing obstacles, namely the deliberately placed marbled rock boulders, as well as being how we activate these gong mechanisms. In essence, our dungeon objective is to bring Yunobo to each of these 5 locations. Yunobo is also a Goron. He's a big guy. It makes sense that Tulin can fly around and keep pace with Link, and I'd argue that the sage avatars we get after the dungeons should also be able to get to and go anywhere as well. That's fine. But for whatever reason, if you use a rocket to fly somewhere, Yunobo is somehow able to just jump over and catch up to you. Why does he even need Link if he can do that? It makes no sense that he be so mobile, so restrict his movements. Make it so that he must either walk or ride the minecarts. Take away his game-breaking ability to warp to the player. Then we would have to approach puzzles more deliberately. Link could stay just as mobile, be able to climb around and scout out areas, or even just get a better view of the tracks to figure out how to approach things. Then you have to get in the cart and actually bring Yunobo there properly. Dungeon fixed. I mean it. Even though the dungeon lacks keys and locked doors like the Wind Temple did, I would say that my proposed fix would act in a similar way. Since Yunobo limits our progression then, we'd still have a bit of wiggle room and freedom to explore the dungeon, but we'd also need to adhere to these minecart puzzles. I know I talk a lot about keys and locked doors, but I am just as cool with something else filling that role. It doesn't have to be a literal key. That's just my go-to terminology. What I really mean is that I need something to impede my progress, something to stand in my way, something for me to overcome and have that aha moment. During this playthrough, those minecarts gave me that, and it was awesome. The thing is too that there are a few spots where I can see that they were trying to prevent circumventing puzzle solutions. For example, this room has a couple of cascading lava falls that prevent us from simply climbing across the walls, and most of the ceilings are too high up to use ascend with, but it's all simply not enough. Zonai devices, vehicles, or even just rockets, make everything trivial. And it's not like it's something you have to go out of your way to bring in from another area either. They literally give you rockets within this dungeon. Why wouldn't players use them? I know a great strength of the game and key point of its marketing is its boundlessness, its freedom of exploration, and its willingness to let you approach things when and how you would like. 90% of the time, that is great. But that other 10% of the time, namely the time spent inside of a dungeon, it is a flaw that could very easily be remedied. Anyways, I've ragged on long enough. Once we've got all terminals activated, we can head through the now unlocked gate and confront the dungeon boss. Entering the boss chamber, we won't initially be confronted by the dungeon boss, though you may remember from the start of the dungeon our attention being drawn to the cluster of marbled rock that formed on the ceiling. Using Yunobo to break this will reveal the dungeon boss. Goma's back, baby. This is marbled Goma specifically. Just as a side note, placing Goma on the ceiling like this and drawing attention to its singular eye really feels like a direct callback to the Queen Goma battle back in Ocarina of Time. It goes by quickly, but I appreciate it. Maybe less noticeable a reference is in the music. For the most part, it's an amped up remix of the Fire Temple theme itself, but there's this deliberate piano piece that is included here, this constant rising and falling, which again is not one-to-one, but sounds to me like a callback to the piano used back in Ocarina of Time's boss battle theme, which was first heard fighting that game's version of Goma. This could be just me hearing what I want to hear. It's entirely possible. I'm no musical savant, as I've said many times. But what it feels like to me isn't that they're trying to replicate the exact notes of those old songs, but rather recapture the feeling, the heart of them. If that's the case, then it's a success. Visually speaking, I think it's solid. Goma has had a lot of different looks over the years, with Ocarina of Time's probably being my personal favorite. Speaking frankly, I did not care for Twilight Princess's rendition with Armagoma, as I felt making it simply a giant spider was reductive in a way. Goma has always been an arachnid, yes, but never quite a spider, except for that one instance. Goma's always been more unique and ambiguous. Here, they leaned all the way into Goma having a stone body or at least carapace, and it works. It's a bit tame compared to what they could have done here, especially considering how visually distinct Colgera looks, but I'm not complaining about it, that's for sure. The battle itself is pretty Goma. It's a Goma battle if I've ever seen one. I've made my stance on giant eyeball weak points on Zelda bosses very clear over the years. I think it is usually very boring and simply overused, becoming something of a design crutch over the years. Goma gets a pass though. It is and always has been a part of her identity in every incarnation, and the fact is she is only one out of many bosses in the game. If every boss had a giant eyeball weak spot added, looking at you Majora's Mask 3D, then I would mark this down as a complaint. However, that's not the case. It's Goma's thing, so it's all good in my burger books. Goma will use her 4 massive legs to try and crush you, spit out explosive rocks, even attempting to barricade you in with them, and just generally try to crush you with her body. You can either try to snipe the eye directly, ascend straight up to it, or the more telegraphed option, use Yunobo to break apart her legs and stun her, which leaves her down and vulnerable to attack. This is a very classic Zelda fight, and I mean that in the best way. It's not the most challenging, especially if you've got good weapons in your pocket, but it does the job well enough. Besides, the most important factor is fun, and I always find myself having fun in this fight. So in that regard, it's a success. Once enough ocular damage has been dealt, Goma will go down. We get our heart container as usual, Yunobo gets his secret stone, and we'll learn about the imprisoning war for definitely the first and last time. Oh, And the Gorons are all sober now. I'm proud of you, Gorons. So that's the dungeon. I mentioned before how the Wind Temple felt like a love letter to fans of the Wind Waker, and in many ways the Fire Temple feels the same, but for Ocarina of Time fans. Maybe it's my nostalgia speaking, maybe it's me just seeing what I want to see, but I love that about this place. Overall, I believe your enjoyment of the Fire Temple will come down to your taste and how you choose to engage with it. It comes down to what you enjoy about Zelda dungeons. For me, my enjoyment comes from the aha moments. I don't want to be politely ushered from one set piece to the next in order to advance a story. I want to work for it. As strange as it sounds, I want to endure a certain level of stress so that when I push past that challenge, I have a moment of earned satisfaction. That is probably the reason I love classic dungeons so much. I want to see the tangled knot, work my way through it, and pick it apart. I want the aha moment. The Fire Temple can deliver that, but you have to choose it. As backwards as this sounds, in a game all about player choice, I feel they should have taken that choice away in this particular instance. My earlier proposed change would do just that. Let Link go anywhere and scout things out. But if we need to bring Yunobo with us to actually make progress, having it so that he cannot teleport around and magically catch up to you would make players rethink how they want to approach the dungeon. And believe it or not, I believe having to think about things is good. If you want an example of how this can be done right, look no further than the Tower of Spirits in Spirit Tracks, which has Phantom Zelda act as a companion that you need to work cooperatively with. That dungeon does overstay its welcome a bit, but man, it has some good puzzles. The cheese factor aside, however, what we do get here is a winding puzzle box set over the backdrop of an incredibly visually appealing fire-themed dungeon. The music is great, the boss is fun, and the puzzles are top quality should you choose to actually do them. I'd like to take a quick moment here to thank you for watching this video, and special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. You guys make this all possible, so thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.